All right, I started the recording. Chris and Strong Atheist, can you try talking real quick so I can test your sound levels?
Hello.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Yep.
All right. Let
Can
me
you hear
let
me?
me bump up Chris's sound here. Can you check the mic again, Chris?
Yeah, check real quick.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Tonight we're having a debate between Chris, who is representing himself as a Christian, in favor for God's existence, and we also have Strong Atheist, who is obviously a strong atheist, representing the position that God is so unlikely to exist that he can be ruled out. Um, you guys have 15 minutes for each phase of your debate. So 15 minutes of an opening statement, a rebuttal, cross-examination, and then we have a live Q&A after the fact. Just remember to keep it friendly, stay away from fallacies, and make sure you back up any arguments you make with evidence or any fallacies you accuse somebody else of with evidence of that fallacy and how they committed it as well. And with that being said, are you guys ready to start?
Yes.
Awesome,
Yes.
Chris. I think you have a PowerPoint that you wanted to bring. Did you want to share the screen for that, or are you just going to go into it?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
go
gonna
ahead.
I'm gonna share my screen real quick.
All right, go ahead.
All right. Let's see. Can everyone see this okay?
Let's see. Let me just wait till
Is that
it
in view?
pops up. Yeah, everybody's muted, so I can see it. Everybody in the VC text, just say yes if you can see it before I start the timer. All right, I saw 2 yeses, so I'm assuming everybody can see
Yeah,
it.
I'll
If
just
you can't see it, just click on the watch stream button and you'll see it. Chris, your timer starts in 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, so this is going to be an evidentialist case for theism. So this is going to sort of be different from standard deductive type of approaches to it, because instead of laying out a syllogism where the conclusion deductively follows if you accept the premises, what I'm doing is I'm laying out theism as an overall worldview as a comparison to non-theism, and then showing what type of data supports it and why we should accept theism as opposed to non-theism. So first, just some preliminary definitions that I think are going to be really helpful for us. I'm going to define theism as the proposition that God exists and has created a physical reality. And we're going to let God be an entity which is personal, conscious. I know I spelled that wrong. I think, yeah, non-bounded, non-bounded and non-limited in any capacity. Following from that, it would have the tri-omni properties, so omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and then finally metaphysical necessity. And then atheism is going to be defined in terms of not a. So it's the proposition that God does not exist and that physical reality is uncreated. There's some semantic concerns with this, such as this should be defined as anti-theism or Gnostic atheism, but that really doesn't really affect the discussion too much. It's really just theism is the A proposition and atheism is the not A proposition. So I think it's perfectly fine to use that terminology for this portion of the debate. So some initial considerations about comparing evidence and comparing hypotheses. So there's, I would say, a way that we can do this that is a pretty standard way that we do it for other things, such as the scientific method. So we take two hypotheses, A and not A, and in order to determine which one is likely to be true, we have to consider these two factors. One is the theoretical costs and virtues of each hypothesis. And these are things such as the simplicity of the hypothesis, the parsimony of it, the explanatory scope, is it ad hoc or is it not, etc. Those are going to be important, and then the evidence for the view. So in this case, evidence is that which is more expected under one hypothesis than another, thereby giving us reason to believe one is more probable than the other. So an example that Paul Draper, who's an atheist or agnostic philosopher actually, gives is, suppose you have 2 jars of jelly beans in front of you, and one of them has like 90% red jelly beans and 10% blue jelly beans, and the other has 10% red jelly beans and 90% blue jelly beans. And one of these jars has the lid glued on shut to it so that it can't be opened. And the lights turn off, and we start to pull these jelly beans out of the hat, so we don't know which jar it's coming from. And if we were to consistently pull out blue jelly beans and no red ones, while this doesn't deductively prove that it can't be the red jar because there are blue jelly beans in the red jar, these blue jelly beans we keep pulling out are very surprising if the hypothesis is that the red jar is the one that can be opened, which counts as evidence against that. So that's sort of an explanation of this. So what are the, first and foremost, theoretical virtues of theism? First, I would say scope, right? Theism gives an account of reality which explains all the relevant data. There are no brute facts under theism. I know there are some people who say God is a brute fact. However, I would disagree. God is metaphysically necessary, as we defined before, whereas brute facts themselves are contingencies that are unexplained. So necessity and contingency being non-identical would mean that necessity and brute facts are non-identical as well. Simplicity, well, theism proposes only one entity, God, who is very simple. He's not composed of any parts or anything like that. And then parsimony as well, because all God's attributes are internally necessary, such that no further explanation can be given. Right? Again, it's a necessity, it's not a brute fact. So things like omnipotence, omniscience, right? This just follows from the definition of what it is to be God. So to say that these are like additional things we're proposing isn't really the case. It's just sort of the way that we would say, like, okay, water is H2O, and that's sort of a necessary factor of being water. So what is evidence one? So evidence one, I would say all natural facts of explanations. This is the supernatural PSR. So I'm going to define natural facts as any type of facts which are limited, composite, or bounded in some degree. So anything from like atoms to trees to other people to brain states would all be natural facts because they're limited and bounded. And all facts of experience are of this type. All facts of like our scientific inquiry are of this type. And all facts of this type of experience and measurement also have an explanation for them, right? We have yet to discover any natural fact that is a brute fact that lacks an explanation. And defeasible reasoning tells us that in the absence of a defeater for this, we have really good reason to sort of make the assumption that this is a universal law, and that unless someone can present good reason for us to say, well, you know, we should actually believe that this specific natural fact or some natural facts can lack explanation, we have good reason to believe this is a universally true proposition. And I would also argue there's epistemic concerns with rejecting this. If the SPSR is false, then there are at least some natural facts that can be unexplained. And this means we may lack reason for trusting empirical data of natural facts, right? If the tree in front of my house that I'm looking at can be a brute fact with no explanation, then it seems arbitrary to say that I actually have knowledge of that tree. And it seems like if we take it even further, we can say like brain states themselves will lack explanation. And then again, it becomes, well, if it's possible that my brain states aren't explained, then it also seems like I have very big epistemic concerns there. How can I trust them? How can I know that I'm actually coming to very good reasons for believing in empirical data? And I would say that drawing an inference from this, that natural facts are explained is an entailment of theism because God creates the universe. And this is something that we would very much expect if theism was true. But it's completely surprising given atheism. Now, there are models of atheism that could possibly account for this with their own supernatural facts. I believe that would increase the complexity of atheism, and it would also end up drawing it just closer to theism to the point where it might just be an arbitrary distinction between that type of atheism and theism to the point where you might as well just accept theism at that point. Next up, moral knowledge. We all seem to agree that we have strong moral knowledge. So this tells us that certain things are morally good, such as duty, justice, and cute puppies, and other things are morally bad, such as murder, theft, and the Joker. Now, knowledge in epistemology is defined as a justified true belief. So if a fact X is true, in order to know X is true, we must have justification for our belief in X. So suppose I come across a clock in the forest that tells me it's 5 p.m., and it actually is 5 p.m. However, the clock is actually broken, which is something I didn't know about the clock. So even though I actually came to a true belief that it is 5 p.m., I don't have justification for that belief because the justification is incorrect. And therefore, I don't actually have true knowledge that it's 5 p.m. Now, applying this to moral facts, given atheism, the process by which we obtain moral knowledge is something like an evolutionary process. It would be solely based on evolution, right? And that means that it's not that this type of reasoning, this obtaining of of moral knowledge, is more fit for a type of survival rather than moral truths. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't gain moral truths from our evolutionary processes. What it does mean is that if it does give us access to moral knowledge, it's just as likely that it's could have given us incorrect moral knowledge, because it's not necessarily geared towards giving us true moral facts, right? So it's kind of more of a chance thing than anything. And it's a chance that's very unlikely. So going back to the clock analogy, it seems very hard to account for this type of moral knowledge given non-theism. Now, theism has a perfectly good explanation for moral knowledge, right? It is something that is endowed to us by God as another thing which he does when he creates the universe and when he creates moral beings. So I think that means that moral knowledge is something that theism has a better account for than naturalism or atheism, sorry. And so this counts as another piece of evidence against atheism. Teleological facts are my third piece of evidence. So there are facts about physical reality, which are that it follows descriptive physical laws. And these teleological facts are highly expected in our theism. Given that God exists and wants to bring about goods such as life and conscious creatures, the universe orderliness seems to be very plausible given theism. Given atheism, it kind of seems unlikely that physical reality would behave in such an orderly, consistent way, right? So if we take a kind of a picture of like there's just one atom in existence, it seems that if it's under atheism, it could just be a type of brute fact that the atom tends to just follow a law-like pattern, right? Well, the atom will just never behave in a way that is non-regular to what we would expect atoms to behave like, right? And if it's hard to explain just that one atom, it's hard to explain how all of the billions of atoms and other fundamental particles all kind of act in that similar accord, right? It's sort of like you look at an orchestra without a conductor, and they're all still playing in unison, right? So that's sort of my analogy for why we should expect these type of teleological facts under theism as opposed to atheism. And again, that's another piece of data that favors theism over atheism. And then finally, consciousness. It's evident that there's at least one conscious agent in existence. Right? Sam Harris himself said consciousness is the one thing in the universe that can't be an illusion. Now, theism entails consciousness. Since God is a conscious agent, there is no possible world that God creates in which there is not at least one conscious agent, namely himself. But given atheism, it seems that there is some degree of possibility that consciousness would not exist. Under an atheistic type of picture of reality, so to speak, consciousness would be a later development in the evolutionary process. And that seems to kind of leave open the possibility that such a late development never could have occurred. And because of that, there's sort of a less probability of consciousness under atheism than theism, but that there is consciousness then constitutes evidence for theism. Now, my final point is I would argue my opponent has a reasonably challenging burden of proof given the modesty of these arguments, right? Nothing that I've said here conclusively disproves atheism. But what it does do is it shows that there's a lot of evidence that is going to favor theism over atheism. And the reason I point this modesty out is because it gives it creates sort of a comparative case, right? And so in order for my opponent to really show that atheism or the non-existence of God is very, very likely, he has to give reasons to suspect that either the data I presented is untrue, or that the data I presented is equally expected under atheism as theism, or more expected under atheism than theism. Or he could go a little further and he could say, I have data supporting atheism which outweighs the data I've already presented for theism. So that's the type of response that I think would be sufficient to sort of start a good dialogue about this topic and actually build a case against my case for theism. But yeah, that's sort of where I'm going to finish out my presentation, and we'll get into the specifics of these arguments as my opponent presents rebuttals, and we can kind of break this argument down and discuss the more minute details of it. So thank you.
Yes. Okay. So the idea of God is taken way too seriously by atheists and agnostic people. Blind faith is not reasonable. It's unrealistic. God is a fictional character. Other fictional characters exist in books, TV shows, and movies, and they could also be outside of time and space. Theists think they should not have to prove God. We should just accept it as a fact. There's no real evidence. We shouldn't ask for evidence since God is outside space and time. Alleged God interactions are not proven. We shouldn't ask for that evidence either. How God came into existence or always existed, shouldn't ask for that kind of evidence either. It's strange that God has claimed to have always existed, yet simple energy and matter must have their origin accounted for. Occam's razor, which is that the simplest explanation is usually the most likely, is what I hold to, versus religion's razor, which is that the most complex being, which would entail a mind and the power to create the universe, actually created the universe. The odds against simple life forming are astronomical. But if you take the odds of that and you compare it to the odds of a God forming or always existing, that's beyond statistically astronomical. And I would go so far as to say impossible. To be complex with a mind and the ability to create the universe can be ruled out. It's just so unlikely that it can be ruled out. Some claim to have some people claim divine simplicity, but a mind and the power to create the universe rules that out. Also, no biblical references address the simplicity. Non-conscious explanation is by far the most likely. Simple to complex is how we've ever observed things. Nothing ever starts out as complex and then starts over at simplicity and then moves towards complexity. There's no feasible explanation for that. It's very much, God is very much defined to be unprovable on purpose. And being unable to prove God is unacceptable. The hypocrisy becomes evident when we're asked for non-God explanations. The non-God explanations better have impeccable proof. God is the least likely explanation for anything, and he would have to be proven to exist before using him as an explanation for anything. God's existence is harder than trying to prove anything else that you may want to try to prove. A natural explanation is the most likely explanation for anything and can be proven to exist. A natural explanation is almost always found or eventually will be found for anything attempted to be explained by God. A supernatural explanation has never been proven to occur in reality. A miracle has never been proven to occur in reality. Evolution clearly shows where we came from. The Big Bang clearly shows where everything came from. Both are more likely than Genesis. A lot of smart atheists are forced to accept one or both of these due to the overwhelming evidence for both. Our morals came from group dynamics and evolution, which accounts for why morals change based on geographic location, and they tend to change over time. Everyone has some good and some bad in them, hopefully more good than bad. If a God was real and wanted us to only be good, he should have created us to be only good, or he should at least make a personal appearance and demand it. People can't decide what to believe, so salvation based on belief is not justified. Adam and Eve contradicts evolution. Exodus and Noah's Ark are not realistic. Immaculate conception and resurrection are not possible. Anything supernatural, including miracles and God, never existed. God is not even a hypothesis. A hypothesis requires being able to be tested. God of the gaps does not prove God. It's an argument from ignorance. No arguments prove God, including but not limited to teleological, personal experiences, objective morals, cosmological, ontological, Pascal's wager, and DNA. Logical syllogisms and other wordplay has never proven God. I challenge you to pretend not to believe in God even for a minute and just look at things skeptically and see if you still have the same opinion, if you could do that honestly. I would challenge you to present any real evidence. If you could, that would be great. You could write a peer-reviewed paper, become rich, famous, and win a Nobel Prize. The arguments that I've heard so far that were presented do not prove God. They're only assertions. I believe that the universe, yes, was uncreated, and I believe that the universe was formed. That's what I believe, from nature, natural sources, non-conscious sources. Everything, such as energy, matter slash energy, always existed. Much more easy to comprehend that than a supreme being with the power to create the universe always existing. And I would challenge you to see if you could prove that to be more likely. Of course, you can use God to explain anything and everything, including morals, but you can use a fictional character to explain anything, because all you have to do is just assert it. Some natural facts can't be explained yet. We call that the God of the gaps. Just responding to some of your stuff here, and if God was not created, wouldn't that make God a brute fact? I would say that consciousness did not exist for a very, very long time, because it took a very, very long time to evolve. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Let me reset the clock here. Okay, Chris, you have your first rebuttal. Your 15 seconds are going to start in 3 seconds after you tell me you're ready.
15 seconds. Yes, I'm ready.
All right. Did I say 15 seconds?
Yes.
Oh, my bad. Your 15 minutes start in 3, 2, 1, go.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank Strong Atheist for being here. I really do appreciate this discussion. I do enjoy this type of intellectual dialogue. So, in regards to your opening statement, what I've sort of got a lot of was a lot of sort of like these assertions, right? Like God is less simple, God is less probable. But if we take that and we compare that to my opening statement, I sort of gave what I would call like a Bayesian case, right? So if we were to actually take my pieces of data and plug it into Bayes' theorem using like the parameters that we've defined here, that X is more likely under A than not A, then what I think we would end up getting is we'd get a probability difference of theism over atheism, right? And I don't think that we could do the same with your arguments, because you didn't really give us, okay, well, here's data, and this is data that's actually more expected under atheism than atheism. So I don't think that was actually really laid out as clearly as mine was, and I don't think that gives us, and so I think it gives us a good reason to think that the case I presented at the beginning is still going to remain strong unless we can sort of break it down a little bit more. So I'm just going to kind of go point by point with a lot of the notes that I took, though. Keep in mind, he did bring up a lot of points, and I don't think I'll be able to obviously address them all, because a lot of what he brought up were simply assertions that I don't think need to be addressed. The one of those is an example that I'll kind of go on, is mentions of like the Bible and specific religions and specific religious worldviews. I don't think that is relevant to the discussion, nor do I think questions about the eternality of the universe are actually relevant to the discussion. This is because I'm not. And I can get us a little bit more, but I'm not arguing that the universe must be sort of created because of its finite past, right? What I'm arguing is that these are facts that we have that are more expected under theism than atheism, and thus this counts as evidence towards theism than atheism. Now, I do want to steelman that point about the eternality of the universe a little bit more. And I want to kind of present it as him saying, okay, well, if the universe is eternal, and eternal things themselves can be without cause, then why should we add another explanation, multiplier explanations, and say God caused the universe if the universe has always been here? So what I think that actually does is I think that's if I get this right, I think what it's doing is it's denying the antecedent of the Kalam, which would be to say that incorrectly say that just because all things that begin to exist have a cause, that things that don't begin to exist don't have a cause. And I think that's incorrect. And I think there are some examples we have of things that are eternally existent, such as even if we say matter and energy are eternally existent, for example, they might still have a cause. So an analogy I like to give, it's a classic Thomistic analogy, which is if you had a sun that always existed, like the sun that's in the sky, right? And the sun was eternal, and you said, well, the light and the heat coming off the sun are themselves eternal as well. Well, in that case, both the sun, the light, and the heat are still created, even though they've existed for the same length of time, which is eternal. So we do have a good reason to think that eternal causation is possible, right? So kind of going forward on to the simplicity part, about how simpler explanations are more likely. I agree, and I think that the most complex explanations are least likely because, again, it's the more things you could possibly get wrong, right? So if we say, like, my hypothesis requires 3 things, but it's more likely I could get one of these 3 things wrong versus the hypothesis that only posits one thing, then I can only get that one thing wrong. So that's more likely to be true. Now, in terms of theism versus atheism, again, theism is only positing one thing, just God, right? It isn't complex because we're not really, oh gosh, I just totally blanked for a second. We're not positing like a bunch of entities, we're just positing the one entity, God. But I challenge strong atheists to present an account of natural reality that kind of closes out in less entities, right? So if we take points by people like philosophers like Graham Oppy, who's a naturalist, even his position ends up closing out in a couple of necessities, right? So he'll say the initial condition of the universe is necessary alongside things like the laws of physics and moral facts and consciousness. I don't want to completely tear apart his point here because I haven't really clearly laid it out as strong as I'd like to, but I do think that you do have to provide an account for natural reality and kind of causal closure that kind of closes off in less facts than theism. And even using your example, Strong, as matter and energy being sort of the foundation, you've posited 2 things. Both matter and energy must be necessary under your view, where under my view, the only thing that need to be necessary is God. So yeah, you said that natural explanations are more likely and will most likely to be found. I agree with that point. That sort of kind of vindicates my point about natural things having natural explanations. But then going from that, it seems like if every natural fact has an explanation, then it seems like we need to also appeal to a non-natural fact to explain why there are natural facts at all, because why are there natural facts at all is itself a natural fact. So that's sort of the line of reasoning I was going with. You said supernatural facts can't give explanations. I just don't see why that's the case. And I think actually if we accept that natural facts have explanations, then it follows that we have to explain them with non-natural facts, because a natural fact can't be the explanation of all natural facts, because then it's not itself explained. You said that hypotheses require testability. I don't think that's true, and I think that we have a lot of other hypotheses that we have that aren't testable, right? If you go to the philosophy of mind, for example, we have hypotheses such as physicalism, emergentism, hylomorphism, property dualism, pantheism, or panpsychism, and all of these are hypotheses that are untestable. But we do agree that there is, some degree of provability there. Like, we will come to conclusions in the philosophy of mind. So I do think testability is important for empirical analysis, right? So if we're saying like, oh, this isn't a fact about empirical physical reality, then it's something that we can test in principle. But since both atheism and theism are metaphysical principles about the nature of reality, we can't test theism just as much as we can't test atheism. But I don't think that counts as a knock against either position, because they're sort of comparative hypotheses. And you said that God is a brute fact. Again, I want to really distinguish between what makes something a brute fact and what makes something a necessity, right? So using just kind of possible world semantics, if we say that X exists in some possible worlds but does not exist in other possible worlds, then it's a contingency, right? Now, if it has an explanation, then it's not a brute fact, right? If it doesn't have an explanation as to why it exists as opposed to why it doesn't exist, because we have these possible scenarios where it doesn't exist, then it is a brute fact, right? Now, necessity is going to kind of differ from that, right? Because a necessity is something that is true in all possible worlds. Whether or not we have like a type of logical necessity as opposed to a metaphysical necessity is really irrelevant. So the question would be like, if something is like existing in all possible worlds or is true in all possible worlds, then what further explanation might we give? So I'm going to push back on the idea that God's a brute fact. If God is necessary, then God is not a brute fact, because necessities can't be brute facts. And even if we grant for a minute that God is a brute fact, like Richard Swinburne, for example, grants this point, his argument is still going to be that theism is only positing one brute fact, namely God, whereas atheism, in order to explain other pieces of data, like the data I presented earlier, you're going to end up appealing to a bunch of brute facts. And so, again, you need all of your explanations for the data presented to be true, which is sort of lowering that probability, versus God, again, only one thing needs to be true. So that's going to sort of increase that probability there. So again, we want to account for things in the simplest way possible. I agree, which is why we should prefer theism over atheism, because theism, again, only one entity, just one simple necessity. So I think I've pretty much covered a lot of the points you presented. Maybe as we kind of open up a dialogue or hear your rejoinders, we can kind of get into a little bit more. But I am happy to concede the rest of my time, and thank you.
Okay, strong atheist. You ready for your
Yep.
15-minute rebuttal? 3, 2, 1, go ahead.
Okay, well, you started out by speaking about my assertions, when assertions seems to be all I hear from you at all. Do you have any proof at all for a God? Any whatsoever? Because I did not hear any. Don't feel bad, because nobody has ever been able to present any in thousands of years, and nobody ever will be able to. Challenging you for proof. I would really love to hear it. So would everyone else in the whole world. At that point, you can submit your paper, get your Nobel Prize, become rich and famous. I would love for that to happen. I really would. I actually would prefer that God exists. I can't accept it in my mind, but that would be a great thing, especially the life after death part, which that's the best thing about religion. But my mind won't allow that to happen. But I just challenge you for any proof whatsoever, not wordplay, just real proof. I believe that the universe was not created; it was formed. I believe that the universe was not eternal. You said that I said the universe was eternal. I did not say that. What I said was that energy/matter is eternal, and energy changes to matter, and matter changes to energy. These are really essentially the same things, just in different forms, where at least they can convert back and forth, as per Einstein, though he called it mass, but same thing. I challenge you to express what is God's cause. Again, nobody's ever been able to do it before. Why should we accept that he exists without any kind of an explanation regarding that? You were just making comments about the sun being eternal, not being eternal. Of course, the sun's not eternal. There's really the energy/matter is the only thing that I believe is eternal, and time I believe is eternal. Nothing else do I believe is eternal, except possibly change. Change is permanent. for you to say that God is not complex is very interesting because um, the way God's defined, generally speaking, is a mind, a conscious mind with the power to create the universe, that actually did create the universe. And if you would try to compare this to simple things, an amoeba, a bacteria, a virus, anything like that, I mean, obviously God's much more complex than that. Any supreme being that could create the universe would naturally entail complexity. There's nothing in any biblical references that I've ever seen or heard that would tell you that God is simple. And just the ability to have a mind and create the universe entails massive amounts of complexity. Especially, we're comparing this to simple life forms that formed after billions of years. We're really just Genesis versus abiogenesis, Genesis versus evolution, Genesis versus the Big Bang. I mean, these are just not on the same par of explanations. The a conscious entity that you're calling simple uh, without justification, in my opinion, is not as simple as zero conscious entities, as that's what I assert. Yep, the matter and the energy is the one thing, that's for sure. That they matter equals energy. So I just mentioned that again, and I would ask for any proof of anything that's not natural, proof of anything that's supernatural, proof of any kind of a miracle, proof of any kind of a God, as we define God, under the general premise of what gods are. Um, and if you look up the word hypothesis, it's actually defined as testable. So all the things that you mentioned as hypotheses, at least we know they exist. God, we don't know exists. So God does not meet the criteria of a hypothesis based on the definition that I read, that it's has to be testable. Maybe you have a different definition than I do. But even the examples you used, at least we know they exist, unlike God. I did not state that God is a brute fact. Of course, I don't believe in God, so I wouldn't have stated that. That was a question I had for you. Would that make God a brute fact? Because we have no explanation. And God must be proven to exist before being a necessity. And then the last thing you had mentioned was you prefer theism over atheism. I do too. I would much rather theism be true than atheism because it's a much better story. It's a much better worldview than I have. Only thing is, my mind compels me to be an atheist because theism not only has no proof, it's the least likely explanation for anything. The main thing, the sticking point I have is where God came from or how God could always exist. To just insert God at the beginning of the universe or before the beginning of the universe does not explain anything. That's the real question. That's the crux of it right there. For any kind of conscious being that could create the universe, that requires some kind of an explanation, any kind of an explanation. I mean, there is none. There never will be, as far as I'm concerned, because it's fiction, but I would love it to be the case. Main thing again that I would like would be life after death. That's the ultimate survival. That's why I believe religion has so much appeal. That's why it's gained so much popularity. Is everybody wants that? Who wouldn't want that? But my mind can't accept that because it's so unrealistic. And I'll end there.
Sorry about that. Buttons weren't working. All right, guys. So we got 15-minute cross-examination. Each person gets 15 minutes to cross-examine their opponent, and then we're going to move on to an open discussion for 10 minutes after that. All right? All right, so Chris, you can go first with your 15 minutes. You get to ask strong atheist questions. Strong atheist, you can't ask questions back. You just have to answer the questions. And then we'll go vice versa. Ready, Chris?
Ready? Yeah.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Okay. Strong. I want to kind of start with a preliminary question, which is, I feel as my opening statement pretty clearly defined what evidence is any type of data which raises or lowers the probability of a given hypothesis. And another thing you mentioned, I do actually have a definition of hypothesis that doesn't require testability. It's on the first page of Google. But anyway, so kind of going off that, can you define evidence sort of? And would you be defining it? Are you disagreeing with the definition of evidence I provided earlier? And do you have a different definition that you prefer? What is your definition?
My definition of evidence is anything that can be proven to correspond to reality, that can be either tested or shown to exist by one or more people. Not even one, at least two people, I would have to say, because I wouldn't go with just one. At least more than one person that could prove something. And that's what I would consider evidence. But my standard of evidence for God, that's different, because people have been trying to prove it for a very, very long time. So my standard of evidence for someone to prove a God at this point would be when someone submits a paper that gets peer reviewed, and then everyone agrees with it, or at least doesn't dispute it enough where they will become rich, famous, and win a Nobel Prize. So that's what will happen if somebody ever does present any real evidence of a God. I don't think it will ever happen. I'm reasonably sure. My personal opinion, it's so unlikely it can be ruled out, but I challenge you or anyone else to come up with any.
Yeah. So, second question. You said that at this point, your epistemology kind of leads you to believing that anything that's not like a peer-reviewed kind of paper would be like that anything that doesn't fit that bill would be no evidence for God. I'm curious if you apply that standard everywhere else, right? So, if we take something like solipsism, the idea that there are other minds, right? There's no peer-reviewed paper right now that says other minds exist, right? We've just sort of come to that conclusion a priori. I would argue the same thing with something like eliminativism, right? Which is that the hypothesis that the minds just don't exist at all, which just seems like something that's very intuitively wrong. And I guess I'm curious, is like, are there other things that don't have peer-reviewed papers and Nobel Prizes for them that you do believe, or do you only believe things that have peer-reviewed papers and Nobel Prizes? And if not, why are you applying that standard kind of differently for God?
Certainly. So it's only that one subject, because it's the major subject that everyone's been trying to prove or not prove for thousands of years. Nobody's ever done it. When somebody does it, then they'll get their peer-reviewed paper, a Nobel Prize, rich and famous. That's what it comes by. But now other things don't require that. So of course I would not need that. And regarding solipsism, so unlikely it can be ruled out. And that's based on observation, existence. Yes, we could be a mind in a vat, but it's so unlikely it can be ruled out. It's just some silly thing someone came up with to try to say that you can't prove anything definitively, or almost anything definitively. And I understand why people ask that particular question, because they want both sides or everyone to at least sound like their view is actually possible, because no one's view can be definite. But it's a big difference between atheism and theism regarding how likely things are. Atheism, the most likely; theism, so unlikely it can be ruled out.
Yeah. So okay. Again, on the Nobel Prize argument, and then I'm gonna move off this for a little bit. Nobel Prizes are awarded in the fields of physics, chemistry, physiology, medicine, literature, and peace. And I'm wondering which one of these categories you think the hypothesis of God would fit under.
I wouldn't know, but whichever one, they would create their own prize for that. If somebody did it, I believe that would be the case.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
If I had to pick,
Okay.
if I had to pick one, I'll go with physics. But I think it could be its own category. But if somebody had real evidence, they would get one.
Yeah, going back to your definition of evidence you gave earlier, you said that it's anything that corresponds to reality. That's the correspondence theory of truth. That doesn't sound like evidence to me. So, if you were going to say like evidence is, see, evidence has to be tied to a hypothesis, right? Because you know, that there is a tree outside my house right now. That's something that's true that corresponds to reality, but it's not evidence for anything unless we also say that it's sort of tied to a certain hypothesis. So I think you have a gap that from evidence is data that corresponds to reality, and evidence is something that can kind of help us in determining other hypotheses. And I'm curious how you might bridge that gap.
Oh, certainly. So it's basically talking about true evidence, real evidence. I mean, there could be evidence that's not real evidence, and so I'm speaking of true evidence, but basically something that can be tested. Okay, that's why I say more than one person, not something that's in someone's personal experience, that's in their mind or something like that. I would like real evidence, and I would like it to be presented. And I still challenge you to present any.
Yeah, so I presented my evidence in the opening statement, and I really haven't heard a lot of discussion about those and those sort of assumptions about the nature of evidence. Again, testability. I think that you're kind of falling into a type of logical positivism, which is the view that we need to be able to kind of verify and test every piece of data. But again, it's self-defeating. For one, we can't test that we should prefer only data that is testable, right? We have no tests that can determine that. And we can't do that in a way that is not a type of circular reasoning. Um, and also, we do believe things without testable evidence, right? Again, solipsism, we're not a brain in a vat. We can't test that. And again, you said that that solipsism is obviously false. I agree, but we come to that as like a type of a priori conclusion. We don't come to that via testing. So I'm curious how you might bridge a gap between, we have to have testable evidence to kind of making that a universal standard that we should all accept and kind of bridge, filling out those problems that I kind of laid out for that type of epistemology.
So with solipsism, we have actual observation. We know that we exist. We know others exist. We interact with others. We're doing it now. So we don't require the same level of evidence for things like that, in my opinion. Now, with a God, we have zero real evidence. I mean, you can claim you have evidence. You have the word evidence in your arguments, but there is no real evidence that you've presented for God. Don't feel bad. Nobody else has either. I'm waiting for it to happen. It would be great if it happens. There's no real evidence. I mean, there's some people they say they have personal experiences. Okay, I don't go for that. Some people might say whatever they want, but it's not real evidence. Once we hear real evidence, everyone will believe in God at that point. But we won't. It's not going to happen. You have a different levels of evidence that are expected for things that we know exist, like other people, negating solipsism. But we have much higher level of expectations for evidence regarding a supreme being that created the universe. There is none. Now, I personally, I'll take any evidence I can get. There's none. But I mean, real evidence, any.
So, and you're saying that real evidence is only evidence which is testable.
Yes, pretty much, unless it's something that we understand that at least exists and have, some idea of the real world. I mean, especially something that's just claimed. I mean, anyone can claim anything.
Okay, so let's say we get testable data, right? So we don't test evidence because again we have to compare it to a hypothesis. So like, right, I can run a test that shows mathematical formulas and background microwave radiation and stuff like that. But that doesn't count as evidence for anything unless I apply it to a hypothesis, right? So if I have a hypothesis that is the Big Bang theory is true, and I have data, which is the background microwave radiation, then the two are sort of independent of each other unless I can bridge that gap, right? So I say, okay, I've tested background microwave radiation. I have this hypothesis, the Big Bang, and I want to show that this background microwave radiation is evidence for the Big Bang. What you would need to do is you need to say, well, this background microwave radiation is more expected under the hypothesis that the Big Bang is true as opposed to not. So kind of going off that, my argument, my evidences are things that we can test, right? We can test it in some way based on observation that natural facts have explanation, right? That's my defeasible reasoning. We can test based on experience that we have moral knowledge. We can test based on our knowledge of the laws of physics, their teleological facts, and consciousness. Again, so I'm curious then. That's the testability, right? We got that testability there, but we need to bridge that gap and say this is the expectation under different hypotheses. So I'm curious how, yes, okay, I have testable evidence, but now I'm saying that it's more expected under my hypothesis of theism than atheism. And I'm curious how you're kind of trying to get around that problem a little bit for your view. And I'm just not sure if you can maybe elaborate on that a little bit more.
Okay, so first of all, with the cosmic microwave background radiation, that was predicted before it was found. So that's really important. I mean, if you can predict something and then we find it, that would be substantial. Don't want to really go into too much of the God of the gaps thing, like as far as, you can't figure something out and you give credit to God. I just don't go along with that. I would really just like to hear real evidence, and I challenge you to do this over and over again. Don't feel bad. No one else can either.
Yeah, predictability is important, but it's not the only standard, right? That we do have, we do have things that we're not like, okay, we predict that this hypothesis is gonna bring that about. And again, take hypotheses like metaphysical naturalism, right? I don't, at least at face value, it doesn't seem like there's really a lot of predictability there, right? Like what exactly maybe theism would predict? Well, theism would predict that we'd have moral knowledge, and that is something we have. It would predict that the universe would follow regular laws, and that was something that theism did predict, right? So if you take something like that the universe is going to follow regular laws, right? Back in 1 BC, people believed in God, but not everyone believed that there were universal laws that were kind of applicable universally. But then theism predicted that, and then we started to look for that, and we realized it was true. So that actually is a predictable piece of evidence in favor of theism. I'm curious, again, so if we're defining the hypothesis God does not exist as sort of the not A, do you have any type of predictable evidence that non-theism has given us?
So, first off, I would challenge that natural laws would have anything to do with God whatsoever. If God existed, I think we should have supernatural laws. Everything should be so awesome. It should be, everything just like paradise. If there really was a God, natural laws support naturalism. Natural laws support atheism. There, I'll leave it at that.
So I'm not really sure about the supernatural law point. If we've got something like again, using like the analogy I gave earlier, natural laws are something like an orchestra, right? Like all of them sort of go hand in hand, right? Like gravity and the way atoms behave and the way that particles react, right? Like all of these things are just things that have to be kind of simultaneously true, and they're all sort of like these things that are kind of coming together in a coherent way. And that seems to be more expected given that the source and kind of cause of natural laws is just one uniform thing, God. But under naturalism, it seems that each of these natural laws just would be happening by chance. So again, it doesn't mean that theism is like natural laws are like incompatible with atheism. It just sort of, I think, means that natural laws are better expected. I don't.
30 seconds
I,
left,
I don't
Chris.
know if how much long. Oh, 30 seconds? Well, that felt like way longer than 15 minutes. But yeah, I don't know if you had anything else to say about that. I'll let you get the closing, the last word there.
Well, I do believe that natural laws are more likely to be natural, hence the word. I would look for supernatural laws and supernatural things if there was anything supernatural. I believe that natural laws um, are by chance, and a lot of things are by chance until we became alive and started having natural selection. Then things were less chance, but before that, pretty much everything was by chance. I also forgot to mention about the morals are from group dynamics and evolution. That's where we get our morals from. That has nothing to do with God whatsoever.
All right, strong atheist. Same thing this time around. You get to ask questions. Chris, all you can do is answer them. Clock starts in 3,
All right.
2, 1.
Do you have any proof at all for God?
Yeah, I gave it in my opening statement.
I must have missed it.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Do you have any explanation why and how a supreme being with a mind and the power to create the universe could exist?
Yeah. So, in terms of necessity, right? Um, what we're sort of looking at is a picture of something that exists in virtue of what it is, right? Um, so if we kind of ask these questions about like, okay, why does something exist? We're asking like, why does this thing which couldn't exist in principle, right? It could fail to exist. But I think with God, because God is by definition necessary being, he's either impossible or he's necessary. I think that the definition that I think that the reason that God exists is just his necessity. Just like the question of like why does a triangle have three sides? Well, it's just necessary. That's just by virtue of what a triangle is. So I think that that's a perfectly coherent explanation of why God exists. And I guess I don't. I guess I'd need further reason to see why it's not a coherent explanation.
Okay, that was part of the question. The other part of the question was how a supreme being with a mind and the power to create the universe could exist.
How a supreme being could exist. I'm not allowed to ask questions, so but maybe I could ask you to clarify what you're meaning by how. Is that okay?
How did the supreme being come into existence or always exist?
It didn't come into existence, I mean, it always existed by necessity.
How?
By necessity, the necessity is the furthest explanation you can get. In the same way that you could say, like, how does a triangle have three sides? Well, it's necessary. Again, the explanation is sort of foundational. There's no more explanation you could possibly give. So I think one account of this, for example, would be something like possible worlds, right? So we sort of like different ways the world could be, and there's no world where God doesn't exist. So it would be kind of incoherent to ask why he exists, because he just exists in all these possible worlds just in virtue of what he is. Um, Again, I still think that's a perfectly coherent explanation, unless you're going to deny maybe necessity as a in principle, and we'd have to get into a discussion there. But yeah.
Yeah, certainly would deny necessity as a principle. I would have to have some kind of proof of the existence of God, like I had mentioned earlier, before considering God a necessity. There's something that's no proof at all. But how is more? How could it always exist? I just still can't grasp that. With a triangle, we understand we either draw a triangle or we can form it with solid materials to have three sides. With a God, how could it exist? I still would love an explanation, but I'll leave it at that if you have nothing further on that.
Yeah, I don't think you can get any further explanation than necessity, and I think that's perfectly coherent.
Okay. Um, my explanation is that it's all made up, but okay. Do you think that God creating the universe is more likely than the Big Bang universe forming naturally without a mind? If so, any proof?
Yeah. So what we've kind of got there is okay. Let's steelman your point a little bit, and we'll kind of talk about like, let's say you want the explanation of the universe to just be the Big Bang, whereas I want to take it a step further and say that it's God. So one of the points that I would kind of push against that, the view that the sort of the initial conditions, the Big Bang, are like the explanation, versus me taking a step further, is again the evidence I provided earlier, such as teleology, um, such things like again, like the moral knowledge argument, the natural facts and explanations. I think these facts are giving us reason to say, like, okay, well, this is raising our probability a little bit towards the theism side, such that, we need to go a step further to explain these facts, other than like the Big Bang. Like, we need something further to account for these other sort of data points that better favor theism. Another point is parsimony. The Big Bang and anything like physical we apply is sort of like the explanation for reality. It's going to have some things like arbitrary limits and composition and complexity, right? Because anything physical that you sort of want to account for is going to be like a composite of parts. So, we need to say, like, this has like, it's made of like three parts, like it's made of like a neutron, electron type thing. So, that's going to be a point of complexity because you have to multiply those things. But also, it's like something that's like measurable, right? And because we can measure it, we can say it's we can say it's like limited in some capacity, right? And the reason this is important is because if it's limited in some way, it seems like we can give further explanation for it, right? Like, we can take it and say, okay, well, why is it 1 to the 100th degree of a mass of it, right? Why is it that mass as opposed to 1 to the 99th degree of mass of the particle, of the initial particle? So just like those types of like conceptual questions are problems for, whereas like, we can explain everything under theism, which is just like God's necessity is foundational, versus like your initial conditions are like going to have a bunch of either brute facts or brute necessities. So that's kind of my reason for thinking we should take that explanation further.
Okay, I believe we take it further too, but not in the direction that you did. But okay, do you think that God creating Adam from the earth and Eve from Adam's rib is more likely than humans being the result of billions of years of evolution? If so, any proof?
I believe in evolution.
Believe in Adam and Eve?
Um, I believe that they were I think they were probably likely a biblical poetry, but I don't have to believe in a literal Adam and Eve to believe in God. So no, I can say no to that just comfortably.
Believe in Noah's Ark? If so, any proof?
I don't believe in Noah's Ark.
Believe in immaculate conception? If so, any proof?
I actually do. I do believe in that, but I don't think that that's relevant to my argument of God existing, because that's taking it a step further, proving Christianity, which I have not set out to do. I've only set out to prove the existence of God, which I think I've done prior to this.
I disagree, but okay, respectfully. Any proof of the immaculate conception?
Again, that's not really relevant to my argument. I don't have any prepared for right now. So as of right now, no, I don't have proof of that, but I don't think that really touches on my initial argument.
Believe in the resurrection? If so, any proof?
Yeah, I do. I do have proof. I think there's a good minimal facts case to be made, but again, I don't think that's relevant to my initial argument.
Believe in miracles at all? If so, any proof?
I believe there's a good inductive case to be made that miracles do exist, and there's a likelihood that they're true. But again, my argument is completely relevant to the existence of miracles, right? Like, God could exist and create a world with no miracles, and that's perfectly coherent. So I don't think saying that miracles do exist or don't exist is really relevant to my point.
Do you believe in anything supernatural? If so, any proof?
Yes, supernatural, God, and yes, the proof was what I presented at the beginning of the discussion.
Okay. Do you have any like real proof that you think I would consider proof for God?
No, but that's because I disagree with your epistemology. I think your epistemology is going to end up being self-defeating, right? So, yes, I believe that I gave proof at the beginning of this video. I don't think that you personally accepted it, but I don't think that anyone has. I don't think you've given good reason um, to give for why we should accept your type of epistemology for determining what is evidence and not. And so because of that, I do think I have good evidence of it. I just don't think it's going to be something that aligns with you personally, but I do think it's evidence that a lot of people are going to find compelling, just because they have a different epistemology that seems to be a little bit more founded on a definition of evidence that we kind of want to accept.
Which is your strongest point of evidence that you believe that you've presented?
Great question. Let me look it over. I think my strongest proof tonight would be consciousness.
What was it? Consciousness?
Yeah, consciousness.
Okay, sorry, you broke up a little there for me. Okay.
Oh, no worries.
And so I guess you disagree with me that consciousness didn't happen for billions of years after the Big Bang?
No, I do agree with you that it happened billions of years after the Big Bang. But I mean, I do believe that God Himself was conscious. I just believe that, in terms of physical minds existed many years after the Big Bang.
So what exact proof do you have for consciousness before the Big Bang or just after the Big Bang, any time within that range? What kind of proof do you have for that? I mean, just say the word consciousness and that's proof?
Maybe I can clarify my argument from consciousness a little bit. My proof for consciousness existing before the Big Bang is the evidence I gave for God. I'm saying that consciousness after the Big Bang points to theism, because given the causal history of reality, right, it seems like it's more likely that we're going to exist in more worlds. Under atheism, where just consciousness doesn't arrive in that causal history at all, versus given theism, it seems very likely that consciousness is going to pop up in that causal history, because consciousness is a greater good, and God seems to bring about these types of greater goods based on omnibenevolence. So that's sort of the line of reasoning I'm going with here. It's I think I'm kind of pulling it from Swinburne. So yeah, that's where I'm kind of arguing from.
Would you disagree that consciousness is a product of evolution, billions of years of evolution?
I would agree that it is a product of evolution in the case of physical minds. I don't think that the only minds that exist are physical minds. I do think that there's non-physical minds, namely God. But I do agree that human and physical minds, like our mind, your mind, my mind, I do agree that these came about later in the evolutionary process as sort of a development.
Has any non-physical mind ever been proven to exist?
Uh, yeah, well, I would say God has, and that's based on like the arguments I presented before. So, I mean, saying that no non-physical minds have ever been proven to exist because God doesn't exist, and God doesn't exist because no non-physical minds have been proven, or I think that ends up being circular reasoning.
Okay, well, it's awesome that you believe that you have proven God. I just must have missed something. Could you tell me anything that I might have missed that why how you really proved God? Because I missed it. Could you tell me anything that I might have missed? Because I'm anxious to know.
How much do you want me to kind of redo my opening statement? Because I mean that's where I kind of laid out the evidence, and this has sort of been more of a cross examination. But I don't think that we've really touched on my initial presentation, which was where the evidence is, where we put the evidence.
Oh, I just must have missed it all because I heard the word evidence, but I did not actually hear any evidence, and I've never heard anyone produce any real evidence of God ever in my life. And I know I never will, but I would love to hear some, but I'm not expecting it. But if you have any, please present it.
Okay. I guess my first bit of evidence would be moral knowledge, and then teleology, consciousness, natural facts having explanations. I think I sort of laid that out. But yeah, that's just my evidence. I mean, I think there's obviously more than that. That was just kind of what I could fit into the initial discussion. I mean, give other arguments if you like. I don't know how much longer we have.
Well, just could you prove any of those things are not assertions? I mean, the morals I had mentioned that were product of evolution and group dynamics. Teleological argument. You can just assert that God's in there, but the fine tuning of the universe could have just happened. You can't say that it didn't through natural sources, or can you?
30 seconds left.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree that it could have happened via natural processes randomly. I don't think it's incompatible with atheism. What I do argue is that because it could have happened randomly under naturalism, where it's an entailment from theism, that it's just a probabilistic weighing, and that it weighs heavier towards theism than atheism. So that would be what kind of lay my hat down and rest my evidence on the teleological side of things.
Okay, I guess we only have a tiny couple seconds left, so we can end it there.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, guys. So we still have an open discussion phase of this. Do you guys still want to do that? Seeing as though we just had pretty much 30 minutes of that. It's up to you guys.
It's I'll leave that up to Strong. I don't know. Maybe we want to do like 15 minutes of that, or like 10 or something. It's totally up to you.
Doesn't really matter to me. I think we got most of it out there. I don't know that we're going to make too much progress. We could take questions if you want, or if you want.
Okay. No problems. Okay, so then are you guys still down for a Q&A session with people that want to?
Absolutely.
Awesome. I'm going to move us to I want everybody to move over to the debate VC stage then. That way we can have individual people on there versus just a conglomerate of people that can unmute themselves and everything. So, I'll see y'all in there. And then Chris and Strong Atheist, just raise your hand so I can get you guys in here. Chris, raise your hand so I can get you in here. Thank you, sir.
All right, there we go. My first time doing this.
All right, so we got the Q&A. So anybody that has any questions in the chat, just raise your hand, and I will pull you in here. And then obviously, Strong Atheist and Chris, if you start getting a line of questioning and you just don't want to put up with it anymore, I think Strong Atheist will be back. Well, he already knows the deal, but if you get a line of questioning from somebody and you just don't want to deal with it anymore, all you gotta say is next caller.
Okay.
All right, raise your hand if you got any questions. If nobody raises their hands in the next like 30 seconds, I'm just gonna call the debate then here.
Pretend this is the atheist roundtable.
Chase has a question. Okay, so apparently somebody has a question, but I don't see him raising his hand. Oh, that was a joke. Alright, so it looks like nobody has any questions. So I guess that's just the end of the debate. Thank you so much, you guys. Oh, never mind. Spicy wants to type a question. Yeah, Spicy, go ahead and type the question. I can ask for you. Okay, we got several people typing in the chat. Okay, so a question for Strong Atheist from Spicy. Which theistic philosophers of religion have you read, and which secular philosophers are you most influenced by? Did you hear that, atheist? Can you hear him, Chris? Is he talking on your end?
I can't hear anything.
Um, Strong atheist, try just leaving and joining back in real quick.
Me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Do you need me to
Okay.
re-ask the question?
I can only hear you guys a little bit, but I did hear the question.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I have not really heard too many um, of on the theist end of the spectrum, but my favorite one is uh, on the borderline between theist and atheist. Depends on how you look at it. Someone named Lao Tzu, who is the main character in Taoism. So that's my favorite. The Tao Te Ching. You could have that read to you on YouTube. That's my favorite.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Just put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm about to close it all out.
I know the question wasn't for me, but I do like to talk about some of my favorite contemporary philosophers. So I'll just throw it out there. This argument was very inspired by Paul Draper and Richard Swinburne's approach, though they disagree on the conclusion. They do use a similar type of evidential case and defining evidence that way. And then, of course, I'm a big fan of Rob Koons. He inspired one of the arguments here. And in terms of other non-theistic philosophers, I'm going to point out, Joe Schmidt. I'm reading through his book right now. He's an agnostic, but huge fan of his critiques of theism as well as atheism. But mostly, like he gives me a lot to wrestle with. And Graham Oppy, again, he's just like he's the real titan of atheism that everyone who's a theist has to address at some point. So yeah, I'll just list them out. Got a question for me about responding to Pandora's box objections. Could you possibly elaborate on that more? I actually haven't heard I've heard it vaguely, but I actually don't remember the what exactly it is.
The long story short of it is if you posit skeptical theism as a response to the evidential POE, then Stephen Law, I think it is, who makes an argument that skeptical theism can lead to global skepticism because we would have no reason to believe that God wouldn't allow illusions to happen, essentially. That's a really superficial glance at it, but
I know I've heard some of that. Like I was in a chat where we were literally talking about this. This has been a while. Well, I don't take the skeptical theist route. Actually, I'm not a skeptical theist, and that's because I like to do these evidential cases sometimes. And I think we have to accept that there is data that is a better fit under atheism than theism in order to say that there's data that's a better fit under theism than atheism. And then at that point, it's a matter of like, well, what side has the stronger evidence? And at that point, I think even if we accept that evil and suffering are better evidence for atheism, there's still an outweighing. Any possible applicability to any theodicy? I don't think I think it would probably be only really a good case for a type of skeptical theist approach. And the way I kind of look at it is like skeptical theism would say the Pandora's box comes from saying we have no idea of knowing what moral goods can arise from it, but there are some. And then it's like, well, how do we know like other things are moral goods that, you know, could arise from like, for example, allowing a child to get hit by a car just because, well, what if possibly down the line that leads to a higher moral good? Like, you know, that's the type of Pandora's box I'm kind of thinking about. But like, I think that something like a soul building theodicy doesn't have that because we're giving a clearly defined reason for example. So that's kind of the way I look at it right now.
Cool. So we just got. I'm not gonna say his name, so I'm just gonna say Sharice instead, who walked in here, and I think he has a question. So go ahead and ask your question, Sharice, and then after that we got Slompy, who's gonna ask a question. It looks like.
Actually, give me a moment. I gotta calm down my sister.
Oh, okay. I'll invite Slompy in here, and then he can go before you then.
I can ask real quick too.
Let's let Slompy go real quick because I just brought him in here. I don't want to
Touche.
kick him.
Damn.
All right, go ahead, Slump.
Strong atheist. What would a supernatural law look like? Like, what would it be?
Would be the world would be paradise. If you were a supreme being and you could make the world how you wanted it, it would be paradise. No reason not to be paradise.
Okay, I'm good.
All right, thanks, Slompy. Let's see. Do we have any other questions in the VC chat before
Okay,
Sharice gets back? Oh, you're back. Cool.
Yeah, I'm back. Is there any room for my question now?
Yeah.
Okay. Just at least two questions for strong atheists. Once again, how did you define like proof or evidence? And or actually, I'll let you respond to that first.
So just something that's true, that conforms to reality, that can be tested, proven, anything like that.
Okay, understandable. And I can already tell your epistemology, but that's besides the point. What do you think about arguments that use deductive reasoning, like accepted premises, or that they fall under axioms to prove something that could be possible?
Well, I go by what is most realistic to me. You know, I believe in naturalism and materialism, you know, positivism. That's what I believe.
Okay, that didn't really answer my question, but thank you.
Okay.
Is that all you got, Sharice?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Dylan, you said you had a question?
Oh, yes.
All right, go
So
ahead.
this one's for Chris. You got me curious. For your statement earlier about consciousness being more probable under the theistic worldview rather than atheistic, I was wondering how you were viewing consciousness. Would it just be a fundamental aspect of the world, or kind of how would you view it?
Yeah. Who was it that someone had a definition that I really liked? I think it was Nagel. It was like the what it's like to be-ness, right? Like, so that's from what it's like to be a bat. Like, okay, so it's sort of like something to be that, right? So I kind of exist in like a subjective first person experience, and I think that's how I'm kind of defining consciousness, right? It's just like what it's like to be me, or like what it's like to be you type of view. Is that answering your question, or do you want me to? Okay.
Not quite. I wasn't asking like how you define consciousness, but how you view it in your worldview. Like, absent, of course, God's consciousness, which we would say is necessary. How do you view like other consciousnesses? Would you say those are a necessary part of the world? Since you referenced earlier, they'd be more probable.
I see them as contingent parts of the world, and they seemed. I mean, I might even say that they're like emergent parts of the world, right? Like it's obviously not the case that consciousness has like always existed in physical reality. Like 10 billion years ago, like there was no consciousness in the universe. There was just kind of particles floating around. Like that's the kind of the way I'm looking at it. So I do see it as like sort of a later development, an emergent part of physical reality.
Okay, interesting. Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Opapis, give me 1 second. I brought you in here, but I gotta ask something else first. All right. Spicy asks, to Strong Atheist, what do you think about Gödel's ontological argument?
Not familiar with that.
Okay. And then make sure we don't have anything else in here. Okay. Then Apopis, you can go now.
Yeah. This question is for. Oh, I'm hearing feedback. The question is for Strong Atheist. Whenever you say that you want proof or evidence for God, right? What would you say is your standard of proof or evidence, right? Something that must be met to satisfy you.
Well, for that particular subject, I had mentioned earlier that they would have to submit a peer-reviewed paper and win a Nobel Prize and be rich and famous, because that's what would happen if anybody ever produces any real evidence for God. I mean, there's so much wordplay going on, so many assertions going on, but no real true evidence, in my opinion, real evidence. Because once somebody produces that, then everyone will believe, and someone will be rich and famous and win a Nobel Prize. It's not going to happen. Hasn't happened yet. Not going to happen. But that's my standard for that particular subject. Not for other subjects, but for that one.
Right. So something they'll get a Nobel Prize, right? So like a test or something.
Yeah, peer reviewed. Yeah, would like to see something peer reviewed that passes the peer review test.
All right, that was it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Apopis. All right. Do we have anybody else? I think somebody else wanted to ask a question. I'm just waiting on them to raise their hand. Mephisto, if you want to raise your hand. Dylan, I think she's server muted, and I don't know if I can undo that. Can you take care of that for me? Oh. Raise your hand again. Oh, and I run you here.
Okay,
There you
I'm
are.
here now.
All right, go ahead. Ask your question.
So my question is for Strong Atheist, and it's can you prove the Big Bang? And if so, what is your evidence for it?
So, first of all, the main proof of the Big Bang is the cosmic background radiation that was predicted and then found. That's the most relevant proof to the actual theory of the Big Bang. But the Big Bang was realized when Edwin Hubble realized that the universe was expanding, and then they played time backwards. I believe it was George Lemaitre who came up with the Big Bang theory. If you play it backwards long enough, it would come to a small point, and then from that point it expanded, and I have never heard anything to the contrary. And they have it pretty much down to a science, no pun intended, that they've got to within a fraction of a second of the beginning of the Big Bang.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Is there anything else anybody wants to ask before we call the debate and just kind of chill?
Actually, I have one question.
Okay.
Are we reading Rasmussen's paper later, or do we talk about that?
Yeah. It's a rough draft, so I don't really know what it's going to entail, but we can talk about that afterwards. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming to the debate. Thanks for being good audience members. Strong Atheist and Chris, thank you for being great interlocutors with each other and being respectful to the server, to each other, to me, and following the rules. So good job, everybody. Thanks again. Let's all move
Thank
to
you.
general.
Yeah,
discussion
thank you.
then.
Yep. Thanks.
Actually, Tracy.
Yo, yo,
Hey.
yo, 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 yo. My name is
We need
Thane.